Hello everyone, my name is Ted Grossart. This is one lecture in a series of lectures for the course Public Participation in Public Goods. The lectures, I'm recording them and mounting them on Canvas, so in case you can't make it to class, you can see my smiling face here. Also, most of the content from the lectures and from the course will be in this book, so that if you have, the book is required for the course in any event, but if you have difficulty accessing class and you need to get some of the information, this book will expand on the comments I'm going to make here and on the comments I would typically make in the lecture. So there's that. So this lecture I want to talk to you about, we laid out in the last one the problem of how different formal players and the public interact with each other when they're trying to make decisions about how to spend public goods, and they don't always do a great job of that, not because they don't want to, but because sometimes the world conspires to work against them. So we're going to take a bit of time here and take a step back from all of that and look at it from an analytical point of view. I'm going to talk to you about a couple of folks, John Rawls and Sherry Arnstein, and some information that they have provided over the years that informs, I think, how to proceed in designing a public participation process. So, public goods covers a lot of categories. Typically it's publicly financed or owned, so the transportation system is typically publicly financed, but it can also be an historic structure. It could be all kinds of resources that people use and or pay for, or one or the other. Any decision made about them will similarly have public impacts. This is a bit of a review, but just so to remind ourselves, money goes in, benefits and adverse impacts come out. They will be differential, so different people will be affected differently. And there are typically, the more complex the problem, the more ways there are to solve it. So later in our lectures we'll talk about how to deal with highly complex problems. But basic expectation is when you're dealing with public goods, they're usually not simple answers or simple questions. It's going to be complicated. So that means you also have to learn how to deal with very large groups, because we're talking about the public in general. This is an important problem for elected and technical folks, because they've got this big messy problems, lots of people involved, adverse impacts, uneven impacts. How do you go about making a decision, and how do you go about honoring the public's will, or even figuring out what it is? Because 85% of people in Kentucky, and I'm sure this is typical of any place else, think they should be more involved in the project development process, and I agree. So cutting them out of the process as a way of simplifying is probably not a good idea. So how are we doing right now? Well, this year the annual US DOT budget is proposed to be $75 billion. Sounds like a lot of money, but you and I all know every day you pick up the newspaper, there's not enough money for streets, there's not enough money for this, there's not enough money for that. No one gets what they want. So in that context, how do we know how we're doing? Well, we thought we would start asking people. So 50 years ago, literally 50 years ago this year, the tail end of at the later stages of the Vietnam War, Sherry Arnstein was a planner, and she first sort of formalized the idea that there are all kinds of qualities of public involvement, and some of them where the agency controls everything, she characterized as manipulation. And she said at the other end of that scale would be one where the citizens made all the decisions. And then you can see the scale steps that she defined in there. And if you count them up, there's 8 of them. So the Arnstein scale is 1 to 8. Well, when we first saw this, we thought, well, okay, so this is kind of interesting. When we go to our public meetings, let's show them this scale and see what they think. So we asked people, what's been your experience in your life, or maybe in this project, if it's a fairly large project, with the quality of the public involvement and public participation that you've been engaged by, and can you put a number on it? So we handed them out keypads, and we'll talk about keypads later, and we said scale of 1 to 8, where 1 is manipulation and 8 is citizen control, and all of 1's in between. What do you think? And you can see down at the bottom, that number, when I made this slide, was 7,000. It's probably north of 10,000 people now. So from all over the country, other parts of the world, we've asked a lot of folks this simple question. And the average score is about 3.7, somewhere just south of 4. So somewhere where they feel like, yeah, we're being consulted, and that's kind of it, and we're not sure what that means. So we're like, okay, so where should we be? What are we trying to do here? Do we want citizen control? I mean, is that our goal here? You're the public, what do you want to do? Their response was, not really. We expect professionals to do their job. We expect us to have a useful role. We would characterize that as partnership. And this score of about 6 on a scale of 8 is almost uniform across all of the people that we've talked to about this. The experience score, as you might expect, is more variable depending on people's individual experiences and where they lived and the quality of the agency. Their expectation was very much standardized around the idea of partnership. So, okay, what does that mean? Well, if you're a professional in your chosen field, this has to be good news because it means citizens do not expect to make decisions for you. They expect you to do your job, and they expect to have a useful role in making those decisions. And that should be what you expect. It should be what you want as a professional. As a public agency, you should want that because it means that the public's role is significant enough that you can trust that you have responded as best you can and that you understand what the public's wishes are. So this is good news for everyone. The bad news is, of course, we're not there. We got kind of interested in this, so we talked to some professionals and asked them the same kinds of questions. And so what you see here, this is, again, this is the public's view, 3.5, 3.7. That's kind of what they said, if you will remember. Overall, talking to a wide variety of professionals, they thought they were doing, easily a point better than that. We're more like 4.5. We're not at 6 yet, but we're not that bad. So this difference is sort of like the we're doing okay sense from professionals. We think, obviously, what they think they're doing is not as important as what the public thinks they're doing, so that's why we wanted to show this to you. The interesting part, of course, is the desired level, both the professionals and the public are right around 6. So there's an agreement on what we're trying to do. There's not necessarily an agreement on how well we're doing that yet, but we have the same goal. Break that down just a little bit more. These are the same questions. Where are we? Where do you want to be? And you can see some differences. Planners really want a high level. They have a high expectation, so that green bar for planners is up above 6. And again, they think they're doing pretty well. They say they're doing, above 4, well above 4. The professional engineers at a conference we went to aren't really as that interested. They want something a little less partnery, a little more controlled by the engineers, and they think they're pretty close. So they see the difference between where they want to be and where they are as only maybe a point on the scale. So there's not a big deficit here in the engineer's mind. The APA, the National Planning Association, you'll see their expectations for public engagement are not much different than the engineers, but they have a less impressive sense of how they're doing. Now, remind you, this is where the public says they are. So there's that. So anyway, the basic message is here that every profession thinks they're doing better than they are. Now that is part of the problem because there's a whole series of cultural issues that contribute to this. As I said in a prior lecture, public participation processes vary widely. So figuring out what the best process to use almost has as much to do with which profession you have come out of as how much you know about participation processes. You pull in a practitioner who has been trained, has a certificate from this place or that, and they have particular skills in this process or that process, so those are the ones they're going to use. So the public participation folks are going to bring you partial solutions if you don't know their background very well. Very seldom is there hard performance data. Very seldom do people document quantitatively what the public said about how they did. We had our own issues trying to get project managers to allow us to ask the Arnstein question. They didn't really want to know. They were afraid it would reflect negatively on them, and they didn't want to know that, which is kind of unfortunate. But you will, as you see, we managed to get enough data that we have confidence in what we're seeing and what we're saying. So, but in the lack of hard performance data, the folks who put on whatever process it is will just say, oh, well, it went great, everyone was happy, and because there's no contrary data. Or the public is not qualified and they don't know what they want. This is a really, really common one, and the truth of the matter is, as we'll talk about in a minute, they have to be introduced to the topic and be put in a position to figure out what they want. People don't sit around and talk about bridge design all day, but you can put them in a position where they can say, I like this better than that. That's on the professionals to do that. So when they say the public is not qualified or doesn't know what it wants, what it really means is the professional is not qualified and doesn't know what to do. There's the myth of consensus. We'll talk more about that later, but basically there's this fiction that everyone has the same idea. It's the opposite of the other one. The public doesn't know what they want. It's that everyone wants the same thing and we just have to figure out what it is. That's also not the case. And the fear of numbers, the more people walk in the room, the more pitchforks, and I disagree with that. More people equals more data, and that informs you. You can be caught in a situation where there are different agencies that have different goals. It's not uncommon. They're not being dishonest. They just have different goals, and it can be a struggle over the control of the public money and trying to get public justification for their view of the world versus someone else's. And another problem is simply the public involvement process is not treated as a professional obligation all of the time, and so low amounts of money are allocated to it, and so poor processes are put in place because they're not willing to pay for good ones. Part of this comes about when an RFP is put out, a request for proposal. It is possible, and it has been done, to make specific awards to people who propose superior public involvement processes. It is also possible to ignore it altogether and just say, you need to do a good job. Those kinds of vague charges for public participation do not help the project and do not help inform the professionals. So the more people, more pitchforks, that's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If folks are afraid to have more people in the room, then they'll do what they can to suppress or just discourage participation. And because they have low participation, any information they do get is not really very reliable, and so they make decisions based on incomplete information, and that then boomerangs when the projects are announced, the decisions are announced, and it turns out people really are not in favor of that. So the professional would say, well, it was a bad process, and the public doesn't know what they want, and blame the victims essentially. It's not limited to just professionals. I'm not just picking on them. Here's a list of, there's 10 articles here that we just pulled off that document all the different kinds of problems that can work against having a good public participation method. I'm not going to discuss all of them for you. You can see from the titles, as we said, competing agencies, a disagreement about what we're trying to do. A vague charge to the consultant. We don't know what we're supposed to do. We don't know what constitutes a good process or not. Limiting the range of design options so that basically the people can only choose the ones you wanted anyway. Public embarrassment, questions about legitimacy. That's the Arnstein question. Is really legitimacy? Is this process any good or not? And it's not. Those are ones that are where people are actually documenting. Here are people who publish papers who argue that we don't want public involvement because it's just too hard to do. The American Review of Public Administration, and I'm not picking on this person in particular, just that this is a typical article that will try to rationalize why we don't want the citizens involved in this. They're not rational. They're not necessarily dedicated to democratic ideals. It's expensive, it's slow, interest groups dominate, direct participation takes money, and it's disruptive, and all of that can be true if you don't do a good job. So if you don't know what you're doing, this will be the case, and clearly this person has had an adverse experience or two. Some people are more straightforward. Philosophically, there's no place for citizen participation in a bureaucracy because the citizens lack technical expertise. This is a variation on they don't know what they want. Yes, they do lack technical expertise, and as we already demonstrated, they want to be in a partnership with the people who do have technical expertise. Those people have to be the ones that put them in a position to help improve the project. This attitude is not fringe. You notice those articles are from a few years ago. We recently got comments back from a paper about the Arnstein gap that we submitted to the American Planning Association. So this is a journal that's read by professional planners, and the article was rejected, and the reviewer said the idea that people are smart, which is what I've said before and which we said in the article, is really funny. I don't know what else to say. So here's a professional, presumably a senior academic in the planning profession, who firmly believes that people are stupid, and he thinks the idea that they're intelligent is actually laughable. So these are common problems. So a few myths here. I try not to belabor this too much, but again, this is a conference we went to a few years ago. These are things that people said, in this environment, it's impossible to involve people. Nope, it isn't. If you don't know what you're doing, it's going to seem impossible, but you can always involve people. They're uninformed. Well, we've heard this argument now twice. This is the third one. No, they're not uninformed. They don't know what you know, but they know what they know, and you don't know what they know as a professional. So you need to be smart enough to figure out how to get that information from them to support your process. Without leadership, participation is impossible. Well, this suggests that people kind of have to be, they're like a herd, and they're kind of wandering, and they don't really know what they should have. And so someone needs to lead them and tell them what's good for them, and then get them to, like marketing. And as I've said before in the last lecture, we're not doing marketing here. People don't know what they want. Well, we've been over this one, so there it is. We don't know what they want because we're not smart enough to figure out how to ask them and put them in a position to tell us accurately. So, public, they recognize they want experts to contribute to this. They want the same level of participation, but we're not getting it, so what do? Okay, well, the foundational assumption is we do work in a democratic country and democratic polity generally, and we're dealing with public goods, and the principles of justice apply. So what is fair? We went back to a guy by the name of Rawls, who wrote several books about this and set off a lot of discussion. About the same time that Arnstein was noting that public participation had different levels, he took a more formal view, and he said, let's think for a minute about what kinds of rules people would like to have for a society if they didn't know how much power they were going to have or didn't know how much money they were going to have. You know, the sort of there but for the grace of God go I argument. And he said two things that they would probably all agree to, that basically each person has an equal right to liberties that don't infringe on other people's. And the other one is a kind of protection, or what he calls difference principle, that they would, in order to protect themselves, they would make sure that the worst that could happen to the least powerful would be minimized. It's an interesting concept. Written another way, it's like everyone has the same minimum set of liberties, and everyone is equally likely to be subject to them, and they want to provide the greatest benefit to the least advantage. It was called the maximin principle, but it's basically saying justice protects the weak. And so it stresses making sure that you have information from those with the least power. And he said there are three aspects to talking about justice. It has three flavors to it. There's the distributive aspect, which is the one, the ratio positive and negative impacts. And we've talked about how the amount of taxes that you pay and the amount of benefit or use you get out of the transportation system may or may not be proportional. That's a distributive sort of justice question. But he said there's also the procedural aspect, and that is the method by which the decision is made, which is where we're really heading this course. And they also said there's an access aspect, which is who gets to be part of the party, who gets to be part of this and gets to have a voice. So these seem pretty simple. I'm just going to take a real simple example here. This is one I've used in class before. How do you divide a candy bar? Well, there are three aspects to this question, right? Distributive justice asks who gets how much, right? So that's typically where a lot of transportation projects, that's where they start and end in terms of who gets how much, how are the benefits distributed. That's where a lot of environmental justice analyses start and stop, always just with who gets impacted in what ways. A more sophisticated question, which gets us around that problem, which is there will never be enough candy for everyone, is how do we decide? I break, you choose. That's a procedural justice question. I'll break this bar of chocolate, and then you get to choose whichever piece you want first, right? So that's a distributive justice process. And you've already figured out the third part, right? Because access is, well, how many people are in the room and who gets to have a piece of chocolate? And what are our rules going to be procedurally to determine how those parts of the chocolate bar are distributed once we've figured out how many people are actually going to be part of the chocolate bar? So a simple example, but it helps you think about it as three separate aspects. So the justice problem for public goods is nearly everyone is a payer, consumer, or both. So there's costs and benefits distributed around. In whatever way they are distributed, they are distributed. And people every day complain, it's not fair this, it's not fair that. That's a distributional justice statement. Any future alternatives, let's say we're going to widen the road in eastern Louisville because there's congestion anticipated. That's a value statement about the distributions of costs and benefits, because they're going to take tax money from all over Kentucky and actually all over the nation, and they're going to build something that's going to create positive benefits for commuters because it will cut down their travel time, but adverse impacts for the folks who live next to the road because it's going to make more noise and more air pollution, which is a documented impact. So it's an alternate distribution of costs and benefits. And so it is inherently impossible for you to plan on having distributive justice in most public goods decisions. You're going to change the distribution of costs and benefits, but you're not going to make it perfect or somehow, I don't even know how you would measure that. It's going to be, you're going to have a problem with distributive justice in public goods decisions. And so it is important that you work hard on the procedural and access justice so that the method by which you get to the solution, which will not please everyone, is the most defensible and the most responsible and has responded as best it can to the wishes and the preferences and the values of the people it's going to affect. And that sounds very vague, but that's where we're trying to get to. This is why good public participation focuses on procedural and access justice. Functionally, it means, from a practical point of view, you want lots of people. You're not trying to minimize the pitchforks, because the more people who get in the room, the more information you get. We'll talk more about that in another lecture, but basically, more people is better. Equal voice for all. Not everyone is a great public speaker, and the folks that sit in the back of the room pay taxes just like the ones that sit in front. They should have the same voice. They should be anonymous, independent, and diverse. They should be protected so that when they have an opinion, they don't have to worry about there being adverse impacts on them from someone who disagrees with them. They should be able to understand the general problem. We should be smart enough to be able to tell them what the problem is clearly, because if we can't explain it clearly, we probably don't understand it ourselves. Find ways to solicit their input efficiently and transparently. They're donating their time. Let's respect that. Let's help them see what the results are. Make sure that the process that we have is going to fit into the decision. It's not just asking them irrelevant questions because we can, but ask questions that are very much focused about the parts of the decision format, parts of the decision envelope that the public should be providing input on. And then do it rapidly. Do it to save them time and to move the project along. So this is what, when I say procedural justice, this is what it looks like. This is a map of, this is a chart of people providing us preference scores for a variety of alternatives around Paducah. And these 12 are different, kind of not very good alternatives, but the best that could be done for this case. And you can see that people were not terribly excited about them. 5 is medium or neutral, and anything below that is less than that. So we worked with the community on some pretty difficult and undesirable outcomes, but they were okay with the way that we went about doing it. The last question, how do you like this process? That fairness question is the one that we're interested in, because it means even if the alternatives are not very good, we have a respectable way of comparing them, and we have included the community in there, and they agree that they have been included in that process. And so those kinds of questions, like how do you like this process? How fair was it? Those are questions we've asked for years and years. Anyone can ask these questions in their project meetings, and I would argue should, and document that, because if that number is low, it means the results that come out of your process are going to be unreliable and undefensible and possibly dangerous. And you may have to redo the whole project if you haven't actually focused people on a fair process for the way you're going to make choices. So if you've probably thought about this for a minute, that you can use the Arnstein scale then to come in and sort of gauge if you've got a brand new project and you're not really sure what's going on in this community. You can use that, what's your experience on the Arnstein scale been, to help you understand where people's heads are. If a low score means there's low legitimacy, and so you need to take steps to improve the legitimacy of the process, emphasize transparency and inclusion, go back and revisit project goals, do the basic stuff to make sure that you have the community on board. If you get high scores, it means they have a good relationship, they trust the agency, and you can work on more complicated problems with them. You don't have to go back and prove to them that you're not trying to cheat them or that you have a secret agenda or any of those kinds of things. So the Arnstein scale can be used to assess the extent to which it is perceived that you are delivering justice. So this is it. The public has a reasonable expectation, I think, the partnership expectation. We're not doing that right now. And we are in some serious denial about that, even to this day. It can be analyzed. We can talk about procedural justice and access to justice as a thing that can be measured and documented. It's not just some airy-fairy idea floating around in the wind. People in the projects can tell us whether or not they're being treated fairly. And it doesn't matter whether they like or dislike the outcomes or how they're being affected by the outcomes. So it's demonstrably attainable. And so we can meet that expectation. We can close the Arnstein gap. That's all my message for this lecture. Next one, we'll start to talk about how to go about measuring our performance and how well we're doing. Thank you.